Good morning and Jai Hind. Welcome to all our guests from the friendly countries all over the world. And my compliments to all those who preceded me here. Some extremely interesting and very articulate presentations. I particularly like to compliment Salman Chishti Sahab for his presentation, which was, I thought, extremely revealing. I am going to conduct this talk of mine almost like a syndicate lecture at the Staff College of the Indian Army. You know, you will find slides here and things like that. Usually, last 4 years that I have been involved with this particular extremely fine conference, I've always spoken without slides, but I felt this year it's about time that on an issue such as terrorism, we came to some more specifics and allowed my audience to also relate to the specifics which I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk to you a lot about a very wide canvas on new terrorism. And at the end, I will have one slide to talk a little about India itself in particular, but that's the focus for us, and South Asia, Kashmir in particular. So I hope I can change slides from here. Yeah. Right. There's no need to define terrorism. I know we are not going to basics. We are not at kindergarten school. But remember, even the United Nations has no definition of terrorism. So it's worth just looking at two definitions which I picked out for you and looking at a couple of issues in that. The first one, which is from the US Department of Defense, few very catchy words in it. Is intended to coerce or to intimidate governments or societies in the pursuit of goals that are generally political, religious, or ideological. So the issue of ideological with terrorism, the connect comes there. The second one, if you see, very interesting again, it aims, the fourth line, it aims to induce a state of fear in the victim that is ruthless and does not conform with humanitarian rules. Publicity is an essential factor. So these are some of the things that we have been generally associated with terrorism around the world. But when we look at new terrorism, you start wondering, is it different? And the broad consensus you come to is that the basic nature has not changed. Nothing has altered. The concept and the intent remains the same. All those words which I highlighted for you in the first slide, this remains the same. It is the second bullet here. It is the means, and it is the drivers which have changed. The means because of technology, the drivers primarily because of ideology. Ideologically, it has become much more radicalized, and the means have helped to spread that radicalization. By and large, you find that there are three groups of people who are involved, prevalent in the practice of terrorism around the world. The first are state actors. If you want to identify states around the world, and we'll all have our political differences in identifying such states. But the second one, non-state actors, we are all aware of. And the third, which we as in India are particularly aware of, is the state-sponsored non-state actors, which means those who have the full backing of a particular state and are fighting a virtual proxy war in your country, in a particular region. So is there a date for new terrorism? Many scholars say yes, 9/11 is a particular date, a cutoff date in black and white. I would always like to leave that vague, because if you really see the advent of technology through the 90s, the coming of the net age, connectivity, etc., is not something which just happened overnight. It was a transcending trend over a period of time. 9/11, of course, gave it that major effect. For us in India, it could very well be 13/12. What happened is the attack on the Parliament House. It could very well be 26/11. But between 13/12 and 26/11, lots of things happened in India. Many terrorist attacks took place, which could all be counted as a part of new terrorism. What is the new age terrorism? What are the kind of actions? Bloodier, more gore in it, suicide attacks, suicide bombings, nothing different. IEDs and car bombs, lone wolves is something which has entered into it recently in the last 4 or 5 years. Unconventional vehicles of kinetic energy, particularly UAVs, is something that we are looking at in the future. Trucks, which have already been used in Europe. Aircraft, which has already been used in 9/11. Very interesting knife attacks, China. In China, Kunming, where you found the Uyghur attacks. 27, 28 people died in a matter of a couple of minutes in a knife attack by terrorists at the Kunming railway station. And you find even gas attacks taking place. The threat of nuclear terror is something which is always hanging on our heads. But I would say atomic demolition munitions, ADMs as they are called, although the threat remains alive, but technologically we have not reached that stage where you find the ability to carry miniature ADMs from point 1 to point A to point B is within the capabilities of terrorists yet. That technology has not come to them yet, although there's a tremendous amount of nuclear talent which is still prevalent in the world after the breakup of the former Soviet Union, but mercifully, this has not yet happened. The other issue is, after 9/11, the very debatable issue, is there a restraint on the intensity or the size of attacks to keep these below the threshold? This is a very interesting aspect of debate because we have not had a 9/11 kind of an attack after 9/11. You had big attacks, but not something like that. Is it because of the response of the United States, the complete international security assistance force in Afghanistan, perhaps even after Iraq? Was it because of that we have still found a threshold? In the case of the Indian context, you will particularly find that there has been a threshold, an attempt to keep a threshold. That threshold has sometimes been threatened. It happened with 1312, the attack on Parliament, and Operation Parakram took place after that. It happened with 26/11. It happened with the Uri attack, which led to the surgical strikes subsequently. So sometimes you find that these restraints do go overboard. What aids New Age terrorism? That's an interesting aspect, and there are a lot on the slide for you to read, but I will only draw your attention to one or two things. I think the second bullet, the first two bullets are the most important, the first being radical beliefs and ideology, which is simply, particularly the aspect of hate groups. It's hate groups which drive this complete New Age terrorism. And the means of information and communications, the smartphones, internet, blacknet you're aware of, even if you may switch off the internet anywhere, the blacknet still seems to be available. You have satellite coverage. Needn't remind you of what happened in Mumbai 26/11 with David Headley, with how the manner in which he came and did a reconnaissance off the map, off on ground and off the maps. Then, of course, there are more lethal means of destruction, a resort to unconventional methods of all kinds, easier training today, and a transnational nature of the whole, much more transnational in nature today because of the kind of connectivity which you have. The type of targets partially changed, seem to be less political, and what we are finding, particularly in Europe, you found the targets were more collections of human beings together, airports, stadia, tourist centers, institutions. In Pakistan, you have found particularly the attack on the Army Public School, which left 142 people, young children, dead, which was one of the most dastardly attacks that we've seen in New Age terrorism. One of the most important things which aids New Age terrorism is financial networks. And who can better understand than in India? You found for many, many years in the state of Kashmir, we used to always talk about the power of financial networks and how it was aiding the whole thing. Mercifully, last year, a very fine decision taken by the government of India that the NIA finally went after the financial networks. And that has, to a very large extent, put a paralysis, for example, on stone throwing, on many other activities which are quasi-terrorist or involved with terrorism as such. Exploiting the internet is an interesting aspect, and social media platforms. You're all aware of, everyone has got a smartphone with them, and how social media is being used for this. It enables 24/7 networking all the time. VoIP, which is something which has not yet been broken. The Skype has yet to be broken. Generation of recruitment through chat rooms. motivation and passion, which comes tremendously out of generation of new ideas. And you have training and literature. You had, for example, the Dabiq magazine of the ISIS, Daesh, which did a tremendous amount of motivation for people, young people, foreign fighters who came and joined the ISIS at that particular time. Some major basic observations about all this. No lone wolf attacks cannot, to my mind, cannot make as much of a political impact as group attacks. And what 9/11 did, a lone wolf attack is extremely difficult for it to achieve that kind of a thing. Terrorists today are far more educated. There's no doubt about it. No great knowledge on that. Although transnational in nature, it is the homegrown terror which is acquiring much greater prominence. And in India, you've seen this in Jammu and Kashmir. After having almost 20 years of dominance by the foreign terrorists, you're suddenly finding local terrorists emerging. And that is primarily also a lot to do with the arrival of the new generation, a new technologically empowered generation, much more ability to network, make use of smartphones and things like that. Defeating suicide attacks has become much more difficult. And the only thing that you can achieve is damage limitation in this. Why do I say this? You have seen the return of suicide attacks in Kashmir in the recent past, and I'll talk about it subsequently in the next 2 minutes. What you require today to resist new age terrorism is more resilience to withstand it, not just stamina by itself. So the last bit, how do you overcome this? How do you defeat this? You have to target the root. And for targeting the root, you have to start from human ideological mapping, which is required in a transnational mode, not just in a national mode. You have to understand cultural terrain. And you found the United States Armed Forces took 10 years, from 2001, when they went into Afghanistan, to 2011, when they actually realized that without the understanding of cultural terrain, you cannot fight terrorism. And that is one of the most important lessons which emerged from there. Subsequently, counter-narratives for disaffected populations, a lot about that has been spoken in the morning. Institutions and centers of potential recruitment have to be targeted. When I say this, I always talk about jails. I talk about labor camps. And I'm so glad that the government of India has finally gone after the central jail in Jammu and Kashmir. The center of, I would say, it was the center of the place where everything used to happen, and we used to always keep pointing it out, and no one would take action against it. Anticipating new lines of attack, preventing the rebound of defeated terrorists, the question I was asking my good general from Nigeria this morning, how do we intend to defeat the Daesh? Daesh has been defeated, we say, but is still in a networked state. So how are we going to finally defeat it? And I think some of the extremely fine model which exists is in Singapore, which is a very, very small state. I won't go into the details of it, but it offers a very, very good model of counter-radicalization and defeating terrorism. Targeting the means, last bit, targeting the means, I would say just one or two things out of it. Control of financial networks is one of the very, very important aspects of it. This is essentially a vulnerability-based analysis, or not a capability analysis, which I'm doing for you. But you have to remember that physical security, the second last bullet, physical security is a very essential aspect. We are realizing this more and more in India. We are finding that our garrisons of the Indian Army are all extremely vulnerable. Without having wire obstacles, without having walls, we can't somehow prevent these attacks. There are many, many other things, smarter border and coast management and more intrusiveness. You have to prevent loss of privacy and rights have to be overcome and things like that. These are all generally known. Creating a culture of security and compliance and awareness, that is an essential thing. And one of the most important things, political cooling of potential zones. You see, you can keep talking about Syria and Iraq unless Syria cools down, unless Iraq cools down. The possibility of ensuring the non-resurgence of Daesh or ISIS it will always remain very, very suspect. So the last slide of mine, is there a new age terrorism in Kashmir? I thought this would be of interest to my audience here. I'd like to remind you that Kashmir is one of the rare areas where you've never had suicide bombings. There were only 3 suicide bombings in Kashmir as far as I can remember. One or almost 2 at the gate of Badami Bagh, one on the bus of 19 Infantry Division at Patan, and one more, which I can't really recall. There were 4 such bombings. That was the past, 2004. After that, there's been no bombing. There have been suicide attacks. There's a lot of difference between suicide attacks and suicide bombing. Just remember that. What you are seeing is a return of what is called the so-called. I call it the so-called Fidain because a lot of people take objection to the word Fidain. So-called Fidain, suicide terror. We have found a re-entry of this. Ever since 2016, you're finding a re-entry of it. And I wrote an article of this also in the national media. I did make a warning that we should not restrict our thinking in our mind that Fidain or so-called suicide attacks can only take place in Jammu and Kashmir or in Jammu or in northern Punjab. It can very well take place in any part of northern India. Of course, increase in the local content, as I've already brought out in South Kashmir, the effective use of the black net and the network with a huge amount of use of the smart technology. Financial networks which have proliferated but mercifully now brought under control. I hope this control continues. And a tremendous amount of emphasis on information and psychological operations emanating from across the line of control, which is having a huge effect on the population, on the alienation aspects, for which we need to find answers. And this is one of the very important aspects in countering New Age terrorism, where you may counter radicalization, you may de-radicalize people, but the continuous emphasis and efforts of your adversaries on psychological operations and information operations, you have to find answers for that. Because if you do not have a system in place, one-time de-radicalization and counter-radicalization is going to prove completely counterproductive. Thank you. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.